Do you know the fratricidal history between Nintendo and Sony? Because before fighting over the game console sector, the two giants were allies before a betrayal ruined everything. But let's not jump the gun and go back to the basics of what will result in Nintendo's two worst Christmases in this new episode of Digital Tales. We are in the early 90s, and gaming at the time is not really the same as today. The industry is still quite dominated by the arcade, and consoles, especially those of Sega and Nintendo, are waging an all-out war. The battlefield of this war is both Japanese soil, from which the two companies originated, and the West, whose appetite for so-called home video games is exponential. What remains of this cruel period are hyper-emblematic advertisements which directly set the tone for this rather spicy competition. As we say in the jargon, it's a lot of fun in a very unhealthy context. Sega, which is a challenger, is particularly aggressive, even vehement in its ads. The giant does not hesitate to openly mock Nintendo players by belittling them in order to brush his community, as well as all the slightly rebellious youth, in the right direction. We are on a fairly high level of toxicity, and Nintendo has it in its throat. The company, which has a less powerful but hyper-reliable console with the Super NES, now wants to strike a blow. In a meeting within Nintendo, a plan to win the war takes shape. To ruin Sega, all you have to do is bring it to its knees with a more powerful machine. Because after all, at the same or even lower power, Nintendo games already win. So with a significant boost in power and graphic quality, the public will not be mistaken, Nintendo will be victorious, and by far. So they need a beast of war. The problem is that we are at a pivotal period, technologically speaking. The world of tech will change with the arrival of the CD-ROM and 3D, and that scares Nintendo a little. It must be said that before it was rather simple. We developed games for cartridges, which was expensive but rather reliable, and on the console side, each generation allowed to double the power. 8-bit consoles gave way to 16-bit consoles, and in the early 90s, we saw the first hybrid consoles looming who read cartridges and CDs, the medium of the future. Sega is also the first to strike with its Mega CD, which adds a bulky and not always very practical player to the Mega Drive. Nintendo, for its part, has partnered with Sony, which at the time was only a giant of sound and image with a world-renowned know-how. Home camcorders, color video cassettes, the Walkman, the CD, all of this Sony knows how to do, which makes it a great ally for Nintendo. And that's good because Sony at that time was proposing two things when it was negotiating with Nintendo. Firstly, they agreed to help Nintendo produce the equivalent of the Mega CD, namely a big base with an optical drive that allows the Super Nintendo to read discs. So be careful, at the time playing on CD was not obvious. We imagine mostly playing audio CDs, or at the very least karaoke software. So Nintendo, by signing with Sony, was not very careful about the clauses. They mostly want their tickets to enter the CD kingdom, and that's about it. For its part, Sony negotiates rather well and gets away with the right to develop not only the CD base of the Super Nintendo, but also the right to develop a machine that will play CDs and Nintendo games, the Nintendo PlayStation, with a space between play and station. In this way, players, whether they have a Super Nintendo or not, will be able to switch to the CD area with a Nintendo thanks to the adapter for their Super Nintendo, or directly by purchasing the Nintendo PlayStation. It's a bit complicated, but in both cases, Nintendo and Sony are rubbing their hands together, except that between the moment the contract is signed and the moment the project comes to fruition, Nintendo's bosses reread the clauses of the contract and find that they are now losing out compared to Sony. As the potential of the CD as a gaming medium grows, Sony's revenue and rights grow within the partnership. We are now certain that Nintendo was going straight into the wall with this contract, leaving Sony as the big winner of the marriage. Nintendo's decision makers had obviously sensed it because in 1991 it was the turn of events. Nintendo, therefore, does the unthinkable, quietly betraying another Japanese company to sign another contract with Philips, a Western company. The electroshock is very violent, and the atmosphere in the crisis meeting must have been rather bitter. As a direct consequence of the betrayal, the CD player project for the Super Nintendo was transferred from Sony to Philips. Spoiler alert, it will become a failure, and the project will never be marketed. For its part, Sony will continue to work on its Nintendo Play Space Station, which plays Super Nintendo games, perhaps hoping to do business with Nintendo again, which will never happen. As you can imagine, in a few months, Sony will go from partner to vengeful and angry competitor. The audiovisual giant will therefore make its Nintendo PlayStation the Sony PlayStation, with the name all pasted while keeping the S in capital letters, as if to say, we don't forget. The console was released in '94 in Japan and marked the beginning of Sony's golden era. War is therefore declared, and Nintendo must now face not one challenger but two: Sega the arrogant and Sony, who wanted revenge. Big time! The era of 32-bit consoles can begin. Sega, Saturn, and Sony PlayStation in pole position, but in the meantime, Nintendo has a great idea that will ruin everything. At least that's on paper. If everyone wants a 32-bit console, we're going to make a 64-bit console. That's basically what Nintendo was planning at the dawn of this 5th generation of console. Nintendo forged a new partnership in 1993 with computer and graphic design bosses Silicon Graphics. If this name rings a bell, it's normal. It's the company that produced big computing machines used in the cinema to calculate special effects, and the first scenes in 3D, Jurassic Park and Terminator 2, for example, are from them. The Japanese giant therefore joined forces with this American company to produce its Project Reality, which would become the famous and super powerful Nintendo 64. In the starting blocks of this project are Rare and Williams Electronics, developers who produce arcade games and are supposed to present the rendering that will be on the future Nintendo 64. Games like Killer Instinct or Cruisin' USA, but which will never be equaled, technically speaking, by Nintendo's future console. One of the reasons for this technical delay compared to the initial promise is the game support. At a time when it is safe and certain the future is the CD, Nintendo decides to bet once again on cartridges. More expensive than CDs, slower than CDs, with less storage space than CDs, but much more difficult to hack. Very quickly in the development of the future console, Project Reality became a pressing imperative because Nintendo had not released a home console since 1990, and we soon found ourselves in 1995. Sony's PlayStation is slowly but surely starting to bury any form of competition, and Nintendo has just presented the controller of its Nintendo Ultra 64, which will later be renamed Nintendo 64. And the controller will blow hot and cold. At a time when Sony was finding its ideal form factor with what would later be the DualShock, Nintendo tried to innovate with its Trident controller, equipped for the first time with an analog stick. From a purely technological point of view, it is a revolution, but the public still needs to know how to use it, and that, I don't know if you've ever had one in your hands, but it's really not easy at first. Because of all these delays in the design, but also in the production of the machine, Nintendo missed Christmas 1994 when Sega and Sony celebrated the release of their machine in Japan. Worse still, Nintendo will also miss the Christmas of the following year, 1995, a crucial Christmas since the two competing machines are now available all over the world, especially in the West. See, and meanwhile, Nintendo is not there, and this absence is going to cost a lot in terms of market share. But during all this long wait, Nintendo has asked itself a crucial question. How do you make the public understand that you have to wait a little longer to have a machine twice as powerful? In order to stem the bleeding within the community, since many will go from the Nintendo school to the Sega school to the PlayStation during the holiday season, Nintendo is releasing an advertising campaign in France advising young people to wait a little. What for? Well, simply because the Ultra 64 will be released in 1996, and bad luck, it's still a failure because the console will not be released in 96 in Europe, but in 97, with only 3 games at launch, a very weak catalog compared to consoles that are already well installed. And the big problem in all this is that this generation of consoles was the one you shouldn't miss. 32-bit consoles are recording disproportionate historic departures as evidenced by the first sales reports. Home video games are booming, and more than 28 million PlayStations and 9.5 million Saturns have already found takers by January 1st, 1997. In this nightmare configuration, Nintendo will only manage to sell 2.3 million units of its Nintendo 64 in Europe in its first year. The overpowered side of the machine does not really go down well with the public, who are much fonder of Sony's proposal. Sony, in terms of brand image, is high technology, and necessarily the choice of games on CD-ROM is much more in tune with the times than the cartridges of the 64. But the other blow of Masu, in addition to the disavowal of the public, is the disavowal of the developers. As Nintendo was behind the generation, many publishers and teams turned to Sony's PlayStation, including Square Enix, which, after a masterful Final Fantasy VI on Super NES, released Final Fantasy VII exclusively on PlayStation, taking advantage of the CD format to sow 3D cinemas of the most beautiful effect throughout its adventure. And then remember, the cartridges are much more expensive to produce, and at a time when the CD is the most competitive offer on all points, and many developers will simply skip a possible Nintendo 64 version due to lack of time and means. After a difficult first few months, Nintendo can only rely on its latest partners, in particular the Rare Studio, which is still loyal, and on Nintendo's key franchises such as Mario, Star Fox, Kirby, Zelda, which will still allow him to give a lesson in game design with games like Ocarina of Time, Mario 64, GoldenEye, Pokemon Stadium, and many others. But if this battle of video game craftsmanship is often won by Nintendo, the company will lose the sales war because of an ill-adapted strategy weighed down by delays. At the end of its life, the console will have sold only 32 million units, which still allows it to beat Sega, whose Saturn will mark the beginning of the end as a manufacturer. However, it is good to note that the hesitations and turnarounds in the early 90s gave life to the overwhelming behemoth that Sony would become with its PlayStation range. The first console of this brand new competitor and former ally sold more than 104 million copies, more than 3 times the sales of the Nintendo 64. However, the legacy of the 64 remains solid in terms of games as we have seen, but also in terms of philosophy, the vibrations, the analog sticks. If all this has become a standard today, it was not a given, and we can thank Nintendo's console for this evolution. Finally, on the game library side, the Nintendo 64 will have nearly 375 games after 5 years of existence, which is still very few compared to the thousands of games of the first PlayStation. Some will say it's karma, others that it's business, but whatever happens, this failed double Christmas will have changed the video game industry forever and given a little lesson in humility to a Nintendo that will take a long time to come back, especially with the Wii and the Switch, more deserving than ever. Thank you for making it this far. Like and subscribe for more if you liked the content. See you soon.